Imagine a rogue state. When we think about a government in this form, one that's gone tyrannical, we tend to think of authoritarian governance, troubling and tense as the laws come crumbling. We think of mob rule, senseless violence, and a head honcho or party apparatus seizing power all for themselves, in strict defiance of the courts and legislatures. What we don't think of is being arrested for having too long of a fishing net, because troopers marching down the streets running into a home without cause is obvious, a typical display of tyranny, and Canada is anything but typical. See, there's this image of modern Canada heard and seen across the globe, a reputation that the Canadian state has been very, very happy to maintain and build. The image of a pacifistic, moderate society where the healthcare is free and the citizenry agree to disagree and where nobody locks their doors at night.
Even here in Toronto, a city of millions, people just didn't lock their doors.
So you don't lock your doors, but we Americans do. Why is that?
You must be afraid of your neighbor.
Our government, also known as the Crown, they love it. They love it. They crack jokes about this image, they affirm it, they believe in it, they put out their own propaganda to embolden it. Check this out. 12th best in the world for rule of law, 6th in the world for civil liberties. Clearly, here we got a country that lives up to the bold, emphatic assessment of its work found in its own constitution, a society that is free and democratic. You can probably tell where I'm heading, but in case you can't, this is all a lie. Beyond the passivity of its reputation, the modern Canadian order is something of a paradox. Its legal project recognizes two separate castes of people, one being the Canadian citizen and all the different classes within that caste, everybody from the low-wage laborers to the venture capitalists. People with a never-ending slew of differences, don't get me wrong, but who are united by at least some of the benefits of self-government and of constitutional liberal democracy. And two, the Indigenous person. The material and legal conditions of the Indigenous nations are that of a second-class citizenry. This is a bit of a risky thing to say. After all, it's hard to lump dozens of individual nations into one monolith. But keeping these pluralities in mind, there are uniting strands that we see on a pan-Indigenous scale across Canada. Strands that form a feudalistic divide between Canadian and Indigenous life. Indigenous people are first denied control over their own land, labor, and capital. They suffer from vast, sweeping restrictions on governing their own land and resources, from hunting, buying, and selling their own food, managing their own logging and construction, and accessing levers to capital, with heavy restrictions on borrowing money and denying them the ability to own their own homes on reservation land, both being explicitly codified directly into Canadian law. At the same time, their reserves are often isolated from broader Canada, and a lot like rural Canada at large, sees few roads, rail lines, or planes heading in from the outside. The consequences of this system are immense. In particular, perpetually lower incomes and perpetual inflation. Price pressures are insane in these communities because of the restrictions on using their own land and the Crown forcing them to rely on non-Indigenous supply chains. These nations suffer from perpetually high inflation, even when inflation is low in the rest of Canada, with many Indigenous nations today seeing price increases of 20% and more on a year-over-year basis. 1 in 5 Indigenous people, near 20%, live in homes in need of drastic repairs. I'm talking mold, bugs, contaminated water, compared to 6% of the general Canadian citizenry. And then we have the somber indicators of both broad-based poverty and legalized state repression. While Indigenous people are still successful in all walks of life, their communities and neighborhoods are clubbed by issues of crime, unemployment, and drugs. The opioid epidemic that hollowed out so much of Canada has hit them even harder than the rest. The kids' high school graduation rate is half that of the general population, and the kids are anywhere from 5 to 11 times as likely as the average Canadian youth to take their own life. From healthcare, housing, and education to incomes, crime, and inflation. Not only are the differences in outcome between these two groups night and day, but they are legally put in this spot, denied vast potential solutions to a number of their community-wide problems directly by the Crown itself. But why? If what I'm saying is true, right, if I'm not lying to y'all, why would the Canadian state maintain a walking contradiction of a system of liberal democracy on one hand and legally mandated poverty on the other? The answer comes down to control. I find that colonialism is a rather difficult concept to discuss within American and Canadian political circles. People often see it as synonymous with invasion, something that nearly every country has been through, rather than its own model of government and society with ideological goals, a specific legal structure, and vast political support, with many folks, even those on the political left, seeing it as not that big a deal, not something even worth discussing. The reason for this is that unlike fascism or socialism, communism, colonialism was never the work of a faraway enemy that American or or Canadian education could rally the children against. Colonialism was and is the Western world's own project, worn on their sleeve as a central mission of liberal democracies for generations. The godfather to modern Western interventionism, regime change, and quote-unquote nation building in countries like Libya, Afghanistan, as colonialism was fueled by a core belief that any land wealthy Western elites occupy could only ever benefit from such occupation, if not to expand the living space of Europeans, then to seize the resources and wealth of other nations to enrich themselves. North America is just one example of this, as the colonialists formed two new states over time, Canada and the USA, while the nations they were built on top of were corrupted, to be blunt. Their ancestral languages and clothing were banned. Countless of their cultural norms and performances were criminalized, while those who continued to perform them arrested. Their freedom to organize and rally for their political rights, the right to counsel and to seek legal advice, were all banned by the Crown, their conceptions of political and economic systems dismantled, all at the total expense of the nation's own health, their children's self-esteem, the power to defend their own from horrifying diseases, their own natural resources, their connections to their histories and fables and values. And in an effort to hammer the final nail in the coffin of Indigenous self-government and empowerment, we have the residential schools, a repulsive violation of the Indigenous family unit by the state, the mother of all assimilation experiments, when Indigenous children were kidnapped from their homes by the Catholic Church and the RCMP, Canada's federal police, under the orders of the federal government. The children were then sent to boarding schools where they were forced to cut their hair, change their names and clothes to those approved by the church and state, as they were forcefully taught the way of life of their kidnappers. Many children never saw their parents again, and the last residential school closed in 1996. This is what colonialism is, a horrifying authoritarian regime that did everything in its power to turn the national identities of entire nations into nothing but submission. But of course, they failed at that goal. I often hear one argument in favor of the settler states, usually coming from Canadians, Americans, or Europeans, who again just don't see colonialism as all that relevant to modern life, which is that many of the Indigenous nations were themselves no angels. They engaged in centuries of warfare with each other across the continent long before the Europeans arrived, and when the settlers did come along, they rallied their troops and went to war with the British and French. In the end, they lost territory through these wars, the same way conquest has worked throughout so much of human history. Can the Europeans really be blamed for starting a war and then annexing the territory they won? This isn't a very strong argument in my opinion. Its fundamental flaw is that it can essentially be boiled down to might makes right, that whoever can inflict more large-scale violence and trauma and destruction on the other should naturally have the right to reign, with the sovereignty and freedom and the histories of the nations being invaded, meaning absolutely nothing. I highly doubt proponents of this argument would tell the Dutch to shut up and accept their new rulers if the Netherlands was one day conquered by an imperialist Islamic power, their children kidnapped from their homes and forced to learn Arabic, and opposing such coercion in one scenario while supporting or otherwise being impartial to it in another is the very definition of hypocrisy. This argument also only addresses the initial conquest of Indigenous land. It doesn't in any way justify the centuries-long colonial project that's existed for generations after the formation of the Canadian state, long after Indigenous resistance had been quelled. I mean, what do we say? Was repressing their economies and kidnapping their children a form of revenge for daring to resist the invaders violating their sovereignty hundreds of years prior? There's a lot more to this story, the history of this regime, but I think I've given enough context as to why this divide exists to begin with. Now I'm going to take y'all back to where we began with something most people never think about, the here and now.
The constitutionally guaranteed rights of First Nations in Canada are not an inconvenience, but a sacred obligation.
Modern Canada has rebranded entirely, stepping hard away from its colonial roots, with the Crown vowing to right the wrongs of its past. In the year 1982 AD, Canada finally detached its legal structure from the teeth of the British. Yeah, it took until 82, humiliating I know. But with this long overdue independence came a new constitution, one that established for the first time a tangible Bill of Rights as enshrined into the country's utmost legal framework. Explicit protections for freedom of expression, of religion, of the journalists, it goes on. And down the Crown's shopping list we find near the bottom the 35th section of the Constitution Act, also known as Section 35, a provision that states, quote, "The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed." And with the signature of Pierre Trudeau, this guy's daddy, Canada had codified explicit protections for Indigenous rights into its supreme legal document. Until that supreme legal document became inconvenient, which we'll get to. Nearly 40 years later, a bold new leader of the country swept into power. Trudeau isn't all that popular, popular today, so it might surprise you to know that he was incredibly popular when he was first elected, across the political spectrum in Canada, spearheading a new paradigm in Canadian politics by the name of reconciliation, vowing to reset the Crown-Indigenous relationship, to investigate the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to reject the authoritarianism of Canada's past. These words were a huge departure from previous prime ministers, all of whom except two were in power when the horrific residential schools were still intact. But Trudeau's election represented the biggest win yet for the mainstream institutional recognition of Indigenous rights. Finally, a leader of the country ready to create a comprehensive federal platform for this issue, to begin a new era in Canadian history, and that didn't happen. Beyond the glitz and glamour of the kind words, the gestures, the apologies, we see a government that still maintains one of the most egregious systems of case to exist in any self-proclaimed liberal democracy. It does so by replacing its former reliance on violence with a system of polite tyranny, where the state's overreach no longer takes the form of men with batons busting down your door. Rather, the tyranny permeates through a mirage of normalcy, the judicial opinions of well-respected judges. It contaminates and infests not through screaming demagogues hammering into the minds of the public who the enemy is, but through civil statesmen and women promising you that they're fighting harder than ever to uphold the rule of law and bring the country together. Now these government lawyers, judges, politicians are the crux of polite tyranny, as they present the inherent injustice of the Canadian state's decision-making, decisions that even break the state's own laws and promises, as just business as usual. Unlike my view of white liberalism, I don't see polite tyranny as a specific ideology, more of a model of governance that allows more stable, reputable, and liberal countries to repress segments of its population without offending the sensibilities of polite society, without showing up in any UN indexes. None of this is also unique to Canada. Obama comes to mind as a purveyor, especially in contrast to the explicit despotism of his successor. The guy would rave in his speeches about power to the people, accountability, transparency, while simultaneously hiding behind his Justice Department and his intelligence agencies to expand the surveillance state and ravage the government of Libya under a pretense of spreading democracy, finalizing the conditions for total civil state collapse. In the case of Obama shows us just how dangerous polite tyranny can truly be. After all, transforming a society from an overtly democratic one to an authoritarian nightmare, most people can see what's going on when the government puts the entire opposing party on house arrest. The tyranny of the Canadian state skates by unnoticed, not by undermining the rule of law, but by strengthening it through its rhetoric, through a liberal linguistic style, and by relying on the legal credibility of longtime judges to legitimize the state's destructive decision-making, making it that much harder of a system to call out and dismantle. Now, do I believe that the top echelons of the Canadian government are maliciously crafting a system of inoffensive-seeming repression in a conspiracy to keep Indigenous people down without anybody noticing? I mean, that's something they would waste their time on, but no. Change in the Trudeau era has been slow, but admittedly, it's still there, from settlement money for residential school survivors to a bill directing capital investment into Indigenous nations. People like Trudeau, his inner circle, these people seem to truly believe that they're doing all they can, but their moves have been baby steps that show us an executive branch either unwilling or unable to fix Canada's broader institutional rot in this matter. Much more focus on incremental gestures and apologies without action than substantive changes in public policy that would improve millions of lives. And the Crown's biggest, baddest tool to enforce its sympathetically hostile rule has been the Big Girl Court. Meticulously and with intention, the Supreme Court of Canada has waged a war on Indigenous self-government over the last couple of decades, and barely anybody talks about it. In doing so, the court has robbed the nations of countless opportunities to expand their economies, reduce price pressures, and to rebuild their national self-esteems in the face of a domineering and violent Canadian government, with the court making asinine arguments to justify the Crown's continued hegemony over Indigenous life, all the while as they continue to enshrine Indigenous poverty and suffering into law as just a given of Canadian society. The provinces and even the Prime Minister, the one who appoints the court justices in the first place, do absolutely nothing to challenge or check the court's methodology. The year is 84, alright, not the 2020s. 2 years after the landmark Section 35 was enacted into law, Ronald Sparrow of the Musqueam Nation was arrested and taken in. His crime? Too long of a fishing net. You see, under British Columbian law, the native food fishing license regulates how long an Indigenous person's fishing net can be. Aren't there murderers out here? Even if he did break a regulation, putting him in cuffs? I digress. Ronald Sparrow's case was a landmark moment, the first test of what Section 35 actually meant. Whatever decision the courts made would define Section 35 for the rest of its days by establishing its case law for the first time. The Musqueam Nation was pissed they saw Sparrow's arrest as most people would. Like, what? It was a fishing net. The nation appealed the decision on behalf of their boy. They They argued that the Musqueam had the right to fish on the territories they had inhabited and fished on for centuries. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and in the case of R.V. Sparrow, the court ruled in favor of the nation, relying on Section 35 to argue, yeah, the nation did have the right to fish, and anybody who argued otherwise was a dirty liar. R.V. Sparrow was celebrated as a massive win for Indigenous rights, a testament to the strength of Section 35, and is to this day pushed forth as evidence by the Crown that a new day is truly upon Canada's federation. But while every headline, every press conference highlighted the win, the Crown conceding and establishing fishing rights under Section 35, buried in the court's judicial opinion was the fine print that Section 35 was not absolute and that Indigenous rights can in the future be broken and violated so long as the Crown can legally justify it. I'm really asking here, what good is endowing a right in a constitution if said constitution isn't actually going to be the supreme legal authority? Sparrow was a win, sure, but the fine print buried in its text represented a court giving itself permission to pick and choose which rights to recognize and which to violate based on their relative convenience to the state. And believe me when I tell you, this fine print was no accident by the court. 12 years later, in 96, a woman named Dorothy Vanderpeet sold some fish to another private citizen. Fishing is really a sore subject for the Crown. She sold 10 salmon for $50 to another woman named Marie. Weeks later, Vanderpeet was charged by the Great Province of British Columbia. She was a member of the Stolo Nation, and under British Columbian law, Indigenous people can catch fish, but they can't sell the fish. Vanderpeet appealed the decision to fine her. She argued the Stolo Nation had bought and sold fish among each other for centuries on the continent. And in the 7-2 ruling, not only did the court rely on the case law established in Sparrow to side with the province, holding that Vanderpeet was guilty, robbing the nations of one clear potential path to lowering food prices, but it also established a true titan of its legacy, the infamous Vanderpeet test, one of the most unreasonable rulings I've ever heard any court make, much less the Supreme Court of Canada, holding that any future claim to an ancestral land, right, or resource by an Indigenous civilian had to originate from before European contact with their nation. So, if Europeans first encountered your nation in, 1683, any practice or custom or tradition that first began in, say, 1844, that the Crown doesn't already happen to recognize as legal, will stay illegal, forcing Indigenous cultures to stay frozen in time to sometimes hundreds of years in the past. Now, the easiest path to see this ruling's insanity is by flipping the switch and imagining for 1 second whether the Stolo Nation could come forward and start arresting Canadians who criticize their council. Because hey, modern speech protections weren't established in 1700s Canada when the Stolo first came into contact with the Europeans. So of course they couldn't do that, that'd be absurd. The poke to Indigenous rights that Sparrow represented became a clubbing blow at Vanderpeet, further and further whittling down what the Crown accepts as an Indigenous right to begin with. In 2014, in Tragically Nation versus British Columbia, the court ruled that Indigenous nations have a right to claim title over broad swaths of ancestral land and to then decide for themselves how the land is used. This case was a landmark, one of those rare moments in time that the Crown came through. It was celebrated as a massive win for Indigenous rights, but just like Sparrow in true polite tyrannical form, the truth of the ruling was obscured by a mirage. Again, buried in the judicial text is that the Crown can still seize Indigenous lands and fail to consult or accommodate the affected nation so long as the consent of the group is obtained. The Crown's opinion refers to the consent of the Indigenous nation 13 times, but never bothers to explain what consent of the group is actually defined as. You can read the ruling for yourself. Since gaining explicit approval from thousands of individual people in a nation is unrealistic, it's entirely possible that consent could be obtained from community leaders alone or by a majority vote. Starting a logging business on your native land? I'm so sorry, not only can you not get a loan, but your council agreed to give up your land to the province 3 years into your business. Time to pack up. The decision also says nothing as to whether consent can ever be revoked by the group, all of which forms a never-ending economic risk for Indigenous people using their ancestral land for any long-term purpose. The Crown can still seize the land based on some ambiguous standard of consent given at a single point in time that may or not exclude the consent of thousands of people within the nation, rendering null any guarantees of long-term sustainability for Indigenous public works projects, wildlife construction, and housing on the land. And to add insult to injury, just 15 days after the land title decision, the court ruled that the Ontario government can seize the land of the Grassy Narrows Nation, do what they want with it, rewriting one of Canada's centuries-old laws to justify their decision. The decision was based on the court reinterpreting an 1873 treaty titled Treaty 3, signed by the federal government of Canada and the Ojibwe, the ancestors of the Grassy Narrows, in which the phrase Dominion of Canada, which at the time referred to the Canadian state, was reinterpreted to mean any Canadian state apparatus, including the province province of Ontario, and in a 0-9 decision the court gave the provincial government the authority to do what they wanted to the land, with little to no federal oversight. An especially insulting ruling when taking in the history of the provinces and these nations, like when Quebec police and the Canadian military sieged the Mohawk Nation in 1990, cutting off all food and supplies and ambulances and journalists and medicine and lawyers from getting in, raiding the community with unspeakable brutality. 2 people died so that they could build a golf course. That's how it started. And then they ended up canceling the golf course. That's one example. For the court's argument to be at all considered fair, you need to assume that the Indigenous signees were aware at the time of Treaty 3's ratification that the Dominion of Canada would eventually be considered one and the same as a separate local government that didn't annex the land until 41 years after the treaty was initially signed. To claim otherwise, that the Indigenous were unaware of this double meaning, would be an admittance that the Crown weaponized the terms of a poorly communicated agreement to enforce on the Grassy Narrows rules that they never agreed to, while insisting that they actually did agree all along. Case after case, decision after decision, the Supreme Court of Canada has whittled down Section 35, redefined what Indigenous cultures even are, entirely on their own terms, narrowed down what counts as an Indigenous right, heavily limited their economic growth and stability, endorsed the provincial seizure of Indigenous lands based on undefined ambiguous consent, and betrayed Canada's own treaty law, all entirely within Crown courts and at the behest of Crown judges. Wrapping up the devastation of Indigenous rights for decades to come, the enshrinement of their economic, cultural, and individual repression into law, all in a neat little bow made up of arcane case briefs too nuanced to ever make the 6 o'clock news. And such is the polite tyrannical way. How many people are going to look through every word of the Tragically ruling to see the consent of the nation isn't defined? How many people even know that the Vanderbilt test exists, much less that it mentions continuity with European contact? These issues are nowhere to be seen in our political discourse, a discourse stuck in purgatory, constantly cycling back to apologies, and apologies are important, but apologies without action is just a government feeling bad for itself.
But it takes a carpenter to build one.
There are those who argue for assimilation instead, removing any legal distinction between Indigenous and Canadian, dissolving the nations into Canada as just Canadian citizens. Now, this was tried in the 60s. The nations hated it. Not only are they naturally distrusting of any assimilation project after the residential schools, but the plan would do nothing to resolve existing land disputes, nor would it respect treaty rights. The question the Crown should be asking is twofold. What do the nations want? What can be done to improve the material and legal conditions of these people to such an extent that the masses of their nations can feel things getting better in their daily lives? Decolonization is the only model that can accomplish this goal. Now, decolonization, in Canada's context, doesn't have an exact definition, and it doesn't refer to complete and total sovereignty. Rather, it gets its name from its push for self-government, above all else. Out of the dozens of self-government agreements between some nations and the Crown over the last few decades, agreements that have handed some communities the responsibility to govern and manage their own affairs within Canada's federalist government structure, the agreements were found to have boosted average native incomes by over 10 grand a year. 10 grand a year! Granted, that's Canadian money, but still. That's a 33% jump over the existing average Indigenous income today, a monumental rise in wealth that would dramatically increase the ability of Indigenous families and communities to provide for themselves. Allowing these nations to sell what they hunt on their land or build their own infrastructure would also do wonders for their food security, as they no longer have to rely on expensive food shipments coming in from miles away. And as for the court, what to do with you? Mr. Reconciliation has so far appointed over half of the justices sitting on the bench, 5 of the current 9, and unlike in the US, where court judges need to pass through the Senate, there's no legal barrier in Canada to the Prime Minister appointing whatever justice they want. The judiciary is a prime battlefield for the fight for civil rights, it always has been, and so any Prime Minister serious about fighting for native rights needs to appoint judges that don't blindly defend the Crown's hegemony at all costs, that would overturn the insanity of the Vanderbilt test, that would interpret treaties as they were written, not as whatever's convenient to the Crown's continued power, and that would strengthen Section 35, rather than diminish it. All of these changes can't happen overnight, and there's so much that I've left out, issues with healthcare, education, crime, and folks who don't live on reserves. But it's a start, from transformative economic growth, closing the broad wealth gap between native and non-native, to cultivating the success of Indigenous-run institutions, allowing communities that have been brutalized and held to the ground for centuries to reclaim their lost lands and identities. Decolonization may be in its infant stages as a legal theory in Canada, but the potential is there for something truly fabulous, a socioeconomic mobilization of millions of people. Now, is this likely to happen? Is Canada actually going to adopt decolonization as federal policy? Probably not. Our left-wing party is more focused on in this than rallying their people for any greater cause. They're not anywhere close to making the judiciary or land access a rallying political issue, and neither Trudeau nor the Conservatives would ever even consider giving this approach the federal stamp of approval. And such is the tragedy of modern Canada, that our dear crown, our big bad state, is down and ready to handle the little things, passing budgets, funding the government, but falls flat on its face when the time comes to do big things. That our big, beautiful, pluralistic society is held back by a ruling class drunk off of mundanity and normalcy, even if that normal has been a living nightmare for millions of its people, year after year, decade after decade. But when looking at the unbridled injustice of our state that has morphed today into a formalized and bureaucratized carnage, one thought will never stray from my mind, that it doesn't and it will never have to be this way.